Welcome to Documenting Your Teaching for Tenure and Promotion. This session today is being hosted by the Office of the Associate Vice President Academic and the Center for Teaching Excellence. We'd like to begin by acknowledging that the University of Waterloo is located on land that is the traditional territory of the neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. The Waterloo, Kitchener, and Cambridge campuses of this university are all situated on the Haldimand Tract. This was land that was promised to the Six Nations and includes 10 kilometers on either side of the Grand. Just to provide you with a wee bit of an overview of our session today, we will begin with introductory remarks and a high-level overview by Jeff Casello, our Associate Vice President, Graduate Studies and Postdoctoral Affairs, who is kindly stepping in today for Dave DeViti. Thank you very much, Jeff. We appreciate that. And afterwards, we'll hear from our panelists, and we will conclude with a question and answer period towards the end of the session. And without further ado, then I pass the speaking baton to you, Jeff.
Okay, thanks very much. And Monica, you'll advance the slides for me?
I'll be happy to do so.
Yeah, thank you very much. So colleagues, thanks so much for having me. And I'm sorry that you're getting me and not David. Dave would have normally have been here with us, but Dave is unavailable today. So I'm happy to step in. And just to give you a bit of background about myself, I'm a professor in both the Faculty of Engineering and in my home faculty in the Faculty of Environment. I have a joint appointment between civil engineering and in the School of Planning. I have served on tenure committees, so I've been part of the faculty committee on tenure and promotion, and I've also, well, I'm now a member of the university committee on tenure and promotion. So have some experience having reviewed candidates' files for tenure, so I'm happy to share some high-level remarks and then turn it over to the panel for today. So Monica, we can jump right in. I think all of us know what tenure is, but sometimes it's just helpful to review what the university defines it as. And really, you know, the idea here is that once we achieve a certain level of academic accomplishments as faculty members, we are granted tenure. And the intention really is to allow you with academic freedom. And what that really means, at least for me, is that it allows you to study those things that might be difficult and to make comments scholarly on things that are, again, potentially challenging for society, for humanity, for all kinds of purposes. And really, this allows you unlimited ability to explore within your discipline the things that you're genuinely interested in and can make contributions to. So I think that this is really important, that we understand that, you know, the idea here is that we're going to allow you to have this honest and ethical quest for knowledge without restrictions as an institution. Moving on, Monica, and you know, with that comes I think we went ahead too there, Monica. I think with that comes some obligation on our part, and I think that's what this slide is intending to speak to. Really what the probationary period is and what you're now, for those of you who are applying for tenure, what you're going through. I mean, essentially the probationary period is a time during which you are being asked to demonstrate your effectiveness. And one of those elements that you're being asked to talk to is your effectiveness of your teaching. And of course, that's what today's session is about. And so really the normal path is that you would come to Waterloo, get an initial appointment of 3 years. You would get reviewed. Then after your first 3-year probationary appointment, get a second probationary appointment. And of course, at the end of that period, you'd be applying for tenure. And so this is really the university's opportunity to ensure that you are committed and that your goals align with the university's goals. And so this probationary period is really, as I said, that this opportunity for you to demonstrate your capacities. And the italicized part here on the slide, make a contribution to knowledge, teach effectively, and do their share to keep the university functioning effectively. So really today we're talking about this record of your teaching and how to document that. So moving on. So what is teaching? This is really an interesting question, and I think probably it's the essence of what we've come to talk about today. What I want to begin to have you think about is that teaching isn't simply how you perform in the classroom, and it's certainly not just the way that your students react to you. Those are important elements, but they're not exclusively the way that the university defines teaching. Really what we want you to think about as you're documenting your teaching is what steps have you taken to first identify what are the important outcomes from your teaching, and how are you designing your courses and your other interactions with students to achieve those outcomes. So we very much want you to think about the full life cycle of the supply of teaching, if you can think of it that way, of the actions that you've taken in order to be an excellent educator. And so it's within your courses, it is, of course, the course design, the environment that you create for students, the quality of the assessments. How do you know whether or not your students are learning the material that you think are the important learning outcomes for them? And then beyond the classroom, how does your course itself fit into the overall curriculum of your program? So what are you contributing to the larger goals? And then beyond the curricular elements, when you begin to think about thesis and other supervision, I'm talking about graduate students or undergraduate students, how are your one-on-one work in terms of your supervisory activities achieving learning outcomes for your students that are enrolled in your program? So it's really a much more holistic kind of thought process than just how you are performing in the classroom. And that's maybe the most important message that you can take away from today's session. And we'll talk more about specific elements of these things. So Monica, moving on. Yeah, so as I said, we're really trying to get you to think about how you can provide evidence to your, first to your school or department committee, then to the faculty committee, and then to the university committee, and of course to your external assessors on the degree to which you have accomplished your teaching goals. And that onus really falls on you as a candidate for tenure to provide that documentary evidence. And so what we're going to talk through in the next couple of slides is how you do that. And what the rest of the session is really about other people's perceptions and other strategies for making sure that you, when you prepare your package for tenure consideration or for promotion, have done a good job of providing the evidence that will be necessary for the committees to see that you are an effective teacher. So when you think about your presenting this evidence, the first question is, what can you do? What are the things that you can provide that will help give your department chair and then ultimately the committees the evidence that they need that you are a teacher, an excellent teacher or an effective teacher? And the evidence, beyond the basics. So what are the basics? Well, the basics are, what courses did you teach, in what terms, and so on. So really, this is, the factual elements. But then if there is anything else that you can provide in terms of the evidence, and so were you awarded, were you recognized by students, were the student perceptions surveys higher than the departmental average? And of course, to know that, you have to know the departmental averages. I think the other thing that's really important is if there are elements that need context. So my own experience was that I was teaching in 2 units, in civil engineering and in planning, and it required 2 very different philosophies and 2 different approaches to teaching in those settings. And so when my first student perception surveys came, or my own reflection on my first courses, was that I had been more effective in one area than in the other, in one discipline in the other, because my approach was better suited to one group of students than the other. And that kind of contextualization can really be useful if there are some things that need to be explained. If you had a really high teaching load early on in your career, if you were asked to teach elements that were outside of your core expertise, those are things that are useful for your chair and others to know as they evaluate your teaching experience. So moving on. One really important thing that we are relying on more and more at the university is peer review of teaching. And I think that this is really important for you to understand what a good peer review looks like. And so this slide is intended to help with that. A peer review isn't just about having a colleague sit in on your class and watch you in terms of your presentation in the classroom. It should involve a conversation with you about all the things that we've already talked about. What are the learning outcomes that you're hoping to achieve? How have you designed your course to achieve those learning outcomes? In this lecture, what learning outcomes are you specifically trying to move towards? And then what assessments are going to follow up the elements that you've presented in this lecture so that you can demonstrate that you are testing for those learning outcomes? And so I think that when you do think about peer review, make sure you have that opportunity to have that conversation with the peer reviewer, to have those elements articulated and identified before the actual sitting in on the course session, happens. So I hope that's helpful in terms of the peer review. On supervision, there are, again, some quantitative elements, and then there are some qualitative elements. So supervision can mean, for our undergraduates, how many students or student groups have you supported in a senior honors essay, if that's what your unit calls it, or a thesis project. If your unit has capstone projects, so I know my colleagues in engineering are very familiar with the group capstone projects in which students are asked to demonstrate their cumulative knowledge. So how many of those have you supervised? Have you had tri-agency USRAs? So have you had NSERC or SHRC USRAs work with you in your lab or in your research setting? And those quantitative elements are really important. Same with graduate students. How many graduate students have you supervised? How many have you co-supervised? How many have you served on advisory committees? How many have you served as examiners, both internal to Waterloo and external to Waterloo? For your students, how many of particularly your graduate students, have moved on? How many of those students have graduated? How many master's students have you completed? How many PhD students have you completed? And perhaps more importantly, where are they now? If you know something about that, it's really useful to be able to say that your students are now holding faculty positions at prestigious institutions, or your graduate students are now holding research positions in industries that are of interest to them, or they are now senior government officials. Those kinds of things are really effective. And the other thing about graduate students typically is, have you published with them? Often publishing is a way to demonstrate that you've taken your students' work to completion, but you've also been active in disseminating that student's work to both your benefit and to that student's benefit. The one point where we're still struggling a little bit as an institution is really to understand how we can demonstrate the quality of our graduate student supervision, or to our student supervision. We have very few pathways for folks to document that. It can be that your students reflect and offer some information. They can provide that feedback directly to you. If you have really good relationships with your students and they wish to provide some more formal evidence of the quality of your supervision, that's important. But just keep that in mind as you're talking to and as you're working through your supervision. If there are elements that demonstrate that you're providing not only a quantity of supervision, but a quality of supervision, it's important to be able to document that. Okay, when you are presenting your brief, this is some important, I think, and useful tips here. You are attempting to be factual and to be advocating on your own behalf, but the tone has to be correct. Confident is great. Realistic is also very good. And so, when we see colleagues' briefs that say that you are singly the best instructor that's ever been in the department, well, that's simply not something that you can provide evidence to support. Maybe you do have that evidence, in which case, okay. But just be careful a little bit about the way in which you present yourself. You don't want to be off-putting to the committees that are going to read your tenure package. And the other thing that I think is very important is that not everybody enters into teaching as an expert or as an outstanding or as an effective teacher. And you know what, that's okay. Part of the probationary period is really very much intended to help you improve. And anything that you've done to take steps to improve your teaching and responding to your APR comments or to your chair's comments along the way, that demonstrates a commitment to teaching. Remember that, this is the key element, is to think about the life cycle of the teaching. So what have you done to improve? What have you done to restructure? Have you rethought a class? Have you changed the assessments? Those kinds of things demonstrate your commitment to effective teaching and a trajectory that will be important for the committee to assess. And I think that this is our last slide, isn't it? Where we have one more, Monica. Right. So just two final points is that the evidence is really important. So at the end of one of your classes, you get a message from a student that says it was the best course that they've ever taken. That's fantastic and should be included, but it can't be the only bit of evidence, particularly if that is up against a student perception survey that would suggest that you weren't your teaching wasn't very well received by students in that term. So try not to rely heavily on those individual anecdotes, but try to put together a comprehensive statement that is predicated on evidence. And you probably know this, but one of the things that happens, of course, is that your tenure package goes out to a set of external reviewers, and those external reviewers are asked to assess your overall quality, your overall likelihood for teaching, and those things normally focus on your research and your scholarship, because that's what the external reviewers are best prepared to talk to. But they may also talk to your teaching, and so there is an opportunity for them to for those external reviewers to make positive comments on, for example, if you are working in a place where students typically struggle with the material, your external reviewer might be able to comment on that. So we just open up the opportunity, or open up the awareness that there may be a place for external reviewers to comment on your teaching as well as your research and scholarship. So I think that's it for me in terms of high-level comments. I want to thank our colleagues who have dedicated their time to come and be well prepared for their tenure, but also for those who are contributing to the panel today. And I think that's what's next. You'll hear from 4 of our colleagues who will provide some commentary and some insights on how to prepare the package from their own perspective. So thanks for the opportunity, Monica and team and colleagues. I hope you find the session of value. I'll be here to wrap up a little bit at the end. So thanks for this.
Thanks so much, Jeff. And now we're going to pass it over to you, Rebecca.
Sure. So hi, everyone. I didn't prepare any slides. I just sort of made a list here of some tips that I thought would be really helpful. And to contextualize these tips, I'd sort of introduce myself as being in the Department of Biology, and also then on our departmental tenure and promotion committee, and in the Faculty of Science. And so I know that the requirements, like, for example, Jeff was just discussing your ability to submit a brief. In science, we don't submit that teaching brief. You just submit a single statement, and it's a statement about your contributions, but it has to include your contributions to research, teaching, and to your service. And in science, that candidate statement is very short. The whole statement's only 3 to 5 pages long. And so I had come to this workshop in preparation for, my own tenure journey, and walked away believing that I should, assemble this like teaching portfolio, collecting all this evidence for students over the time during my probationary period. And I ended up not really being able to make use of it because I had to condense all my evidence of teaching excellence down to 1 page out of that 3 to 5 page statement. However, there are some tricks to try to fit in more evidence of your teaching excellence. And so that's sort of what I'm going to focus on. But the key thing is really to distill that evidence, I think, down to the smallest amount that you can, to save as much space as possible to talk about all of your other accomplishments. And so, I think you want to give a brief summary about it. So I said something like, I've served as an instructor of record for over 2,500 undergraduates, including first year and fourth year students, as well as supervising 4 undergraduate honors thesis students, 6 masters, and 1 PhD student. And then under that initial subheading, I used that initial paragraph, I used subheadings to try to give it some structure. So I started by talking about my philosophy. I had a very short paragraph about that, 3 paragraphs on teaching practice, and each one highlighted different related examples. So things like, where you used active learning or where you used scaffolding. I had one on peer review because I incorporate a lot of peer review in my courses as different assessments. And then after that sort of section on practice, I included a paragraph on feedback from students and how I kind of solicited that feedback, and then how I applied it to improve my teaching. So as Jeff was saying, to demonstrate some kind of improvement through time and development in your teaching skills. So that's a really great opportunity where you can contextualize if you, say, teach a really large first year course with no additional support, and so you're sort of restricted to doing certain assessments, or you're teaching a course that's sort of outside your field. These are areas where you kind of talk about that student feedback. And then a section on any training that you took. And so that also contributes to that sense of commitment to teaching and to improving your teaching skills. And so if you take any courses by the CTE, like this one, courses like that, or even just participation in workshops or training seminars on teaching, that's a great place to kind of summarize all of that. But again, it has to be really, really short. And then a final one, supervision counts under policy 77 as teaching, which was a surprise to me because I thought that my graduate student supervision, at least, maybe not my undergraduate student thesis, but certainly the graduate students would have counted under research. It's kind of, you can fit it into both, but it definitely is a part of the teaching you're providing. So I guess my tip is like using structure to try to really condense it, to use a few targeted examples of the practices that you're applying that are kind of state of the art to try to really improve your teaching, and making sure that you focus on how you've incorporated feedback and how you've made a commitment or demonstrated your commitment to teaching improvement. And then take some of those CTE courses, especially if you have like a lower score on any of your teaching evaluations by students, or you have any directed feedback in your performance evaluations. This is a great way to kind of demonstrate you're making an effort to improve and you're responsive to that feedback. And then I would also say make sure that you get peer evaluations to include to supplement your submission, that those peer evaluations, get them early. I didn't really get the guidance to do that until I think it was the year that I was putting my application for tenure together. And so they were a bit rushed, and they ended up being more of those observations of my teaching practice than that sort of holistic life cycle type of assessment that Jeff had mentioned. So a CTE liaison could do this for you, or your teaching fellow within your department would be a great person to approach. But do it early so that, if it's not great, you can get another one. You still have time to get an additional sort of review, and that the person doing that review has enough time to look through your materials and isn't just kind of attending one lecture or one lab and then trying to kind of assess that whole life cycle of your teaching in just one experience. I also participated in the Teaching Squares program, which I think you can initiate within your own department, even if there isn't one. And so if you have questions about that, I can talk about it afterwards. But that was really helpful to me in my early years and did provide some feedback that I could kind of supplement those peer reviews with. Solicit some written feedback from your students above and beyond those, learn-based surveys that they all do. I used a start, stop, continue model to solicit feedback around the middle of term when there was still enough time to implement some of those recommendations from the students. And I found that provided some really helpful feedback, not just to help me improve my teaching and offering of the course as I was delivering it, but also then later on reflection, I could kind of talk about those and the practice of doing them in my teaching statement. But I would say, I had collected all these quotes, and I think that was a bit of a waste of effort because there really isn't enough time or space to include them in your statement. So unless you're allowed to have sort of a lengthier brief, it's, the quotes aren't so valuable. But if there's anything you can do that's sort of summative to roll those together, or if you get one really nice quote that supports what you've been saying about how a practice you adopted, for example, was targeted to really help something. So one example, I used concept mapping. I attended the CTE workshop on concept mapping in teaching, and then I used it as the reviews for every unit in my first year course. And then I had a student who wrote this nice comment about how they found that a novel technique they'd never experienced before, but it was actually so helpful, and they were going to start applying it in all of their courses to help them understand the connections among the units. And it was a succinct quote that precisely kind of substantiated what I was saying was the purpose of implementing that practice. So that tied nicely together. And then my last tip is to really weave your teaching accomplishments throughout the whole application, because you're so restricted in the statement. So there's a lot that you can cover in the CV. You can have a section on teaching, obviously explicitly about teaching, but also under your service section, if you did any work about curriculum development, if you gave any talks, like this one for the CTE, if you did any course development, if you're doing textbook reviews, also if you have published any papers that came out of a course you were that were sort of student-led, or all the papers that are done by your graduate students, highlight those where you're listing your publications. So in both the research section and the service section, there's a lot of opportunities to really emphasize where you're sort of demonstrating excellence in teaching, even though that's not the purpose of the section. And that allows you to kind of make the most out of the short statement that you're allowed to have. 7 minutes and 7 tips. And I know I shared them with Monica, so she said she would circulate them to people afterwards. So Monica, do I just
thank you so much? No, you're wonderful, Rebecca. Thank you. I will indeed be sharing those out. Thank you kindly. Now we're going to invite James to speak, please.
It might help if I actually turn on my camera and my mic, I guess, Monica. Thank you for this, and I think why don't you go to my first slide there, Monica? I don't remember what I took here was I have 3 slides. Basically, what I did, what I wish I had done, and some learning things for me. I'm in engineering, so it would be slightly different. I know that everybody's departments will have slightly different requirements. So I think I had a 2-page brief that included all of my research, teaching, and service kind of contributions. But that's supplemented by all the other documents as well. So there's not just the one document, there's other documents as well. And so what I'll do is I'll just go through what I did in terms of what I did for my teaching, my brief. I started in July 1st, and this was really good because that's the deadline for submitting your documents. July 1st is 5 years, so it was really kind of clean that way. I did not take an early sabbatical, and I'll come back to that about why, although in a lot of ways I wish I had. The one thing that I found to be kind of useful, and this was kind of in hindsight only because I thought I didn't really understand this, but I will really, as you know, is it takes time. So I remember, as Rebecca mentioned, it's short, so you kind of need to distill down all the stuff, but you still have all these records, right? So you have these reports that you do every year, at least we do in our department, where we keep an updated record of all these inputs, so the courses, students, all that stuff. And at the time, I did them fairly diligently every year. I really tried to maintain them, partly because I just felt like I needed to do that pretty regularly. I hate bean counting. That's not something, I just really don't like it. But I found that, it was a good time to do it because it's right after the term ends, right before the next term starts. So I spent time on it. To make sure that I captured as much as I could every year. And I felt that was really helpful when I came to putting my dossier together because I had it all in front of me. I didn't have to re-find everything, which of course will take a lot of time. So that's kind of one thing that just an easy tip, right, is to keep records, try to do it regularly. In it, I put all my course evaluations, of course, I put in recognitions, whatever I had. All of the student supervision stuff, all of the workshops, just as Jeff and Rebecca have recommended as well, to take the workshops, especially those that as you indicated, as others have indicated, areas of weakness, because that comment about the committee will be looking for holes. You can't hide the holes. They're too good at finding them. In fact, that's what we do, is we look for holes in things all the time. So they're very good at it. So it's easier to say, this is my hole, this is my weakness, and basically I'm doing things to improve on it. So for example, I took the instructional skills workshop, the ISW, Gord Stubley did for me. I was really, really pleased with the workshop, and I can put it on my dossier as well. And of course, any course development, I developed the course, so that was something that I spent a lot of time on, and putting that together also shows that I'm interested in developing the curriculum. The other thing I did was I got a lot of sample documents from my colleagues, because they're relatively department specific. I got a lot of samples, so and my colleagues were very kind about that and generous. The ones that I found the most useful actually were the ones that they got a lot of comments back from the initial reviews at the department level. And so they would have to get responses. They had to prepare responses. So I've actually found those particularly useful because it really highlighted how that process went. And I didn't just get good good ones, but also ones that had to go back and get revised, which is not uncommon. I'm guessing here, Jeff probably has more experience. I'm not on any promotion committees. So including those sample documents, I felt was very useful. Next slide, please, Monica. Okay, so there's a couple of things that I did want to highlight that I wish I hadn't done, only because in hindsight it would have made things easier on the tenure package side of things. So I taught 4 terms of capstone. So this is Mechatronics, MT's Mechatronics capstone. Fantastic course, great course, really great experience for me as an incoming faculty member, but there are no course evaluations. So this really put a hindrance on me. So what I have here in the bottom is a table that I put in of all the evaluations of all the courses that I had put into my brief. And you'll notice all the highlighted ones do not have course evaluations. So that I'm basically down 4 course evaluations, which forms a big part of the quantitative aspect of my brief. So I did have 13 total credits in terms of teaching and coursework. But only 9 evaluations. And that really limited my opportunity to take an early sabbatical, because I was basically encouraged to make sure I had enough evaluations in my brief. So that's one of the things. Next slide, please, Monica. Okay, so what I wish I had done, there's a couple things that people are recommending here, the teaching squares or other formal teaching assessments. I didn't take advantage of that. I had some feedback from peers and experienced instructors, but they were basically on a lecture to lecture basis, not on that kind of holistic scale. I do think that matters. If anything, it really shows that you care. It shows you're committed, and for me, I think it would have been helpful to help identify the weaknesses and try to address them. I didn't engage a lot in course and curriculum development. I did my own course, but that was because that's what I wanted to do. But I didn't really spend a lot of time in curriculum development. I kind of wish I had, because it might have helped in the development of my own course. The other thing I wish I had done more of was educational research activities. So for engineering, there's this, we have something called a Canadian Design Workshop, which tends to be more around educational matters, pedagogical matters. So it's very useful that way. I wish I had done some of that. I did some of that after I had submitted my brief, and they're not hard to do. You embed them into your coursework, and it's actually quite good. And then the last thing I wanted to mention was to demonstrate flexibility. As I've kind of gone on, now that I'm past, I'm tenured, I do think the flexibility is really important, partly because as a unit, we really want to make sure that we cover all our bases. But more than anything, under the pandemic conditions, I feel it's particularly important. That's all I have. Oh, yes, and this is a portrait of a tenured UW professor. I got the message literally 2 weeks or 3 weeks after we went into lockdown. So we were all at home, and that's me. Thank you, Monica.
Thanks so much for sharing that, James. That's great. Karla, we'll ask you to come forward now, please.
Thanks so much. Awesome. I'm going to provide just a little bit of context so you understand where I'm coming from with my suggestions. So I was preparing my tenure package in 2019 while I was pregnant with my second child. So I had one child running around and another one on the way. And also my initial training took place overseas. So I did my PhD in New Zealand at the University of Otago. And then I did a postdoc in Sweden, and then my first post was in the UK. So I share this because my training before returning to Canada did not equip me for the tenure process. I didn't have a clear understanding of the process, and so I started my role pretty naive in terms of where I should prioritize my time. Next, I'm going to share that I'm a qualitative researcher, and I'm primarily curious about people's lived experiences. And I suppose our annual performance reviews have really kind of pushed my level of comfort in terms of preparing me for drafting my candidate statement, because I really needed to kind of get comfortable with honing quantitative evidence. Oh, Monica, you can go to the next slide, please. Thanks so much. And then lastly, I'll just say that I won't suggest explicitly word counts or page limits for the teaching part of your candidate statement, because what I learned is that every department and every faculty is different in terms of the recommendations. So the first piece of advice, like others have already stated, it's important to kind of ask your peers to share their drafts so you can kind of get an understanding of what's expected. At the outset of my teaching section, I reflected on my exceptional ratings in both my student evaluations and also the performance reviews. And this led to capturing my commitment to teaching and professional development, reflecting on the 24 training and development sessions I participated in CTE. And I think that this training demonstrated my commitment to professional development, but maybe also, like what I was mentioning before, I was a little bit distracted. I spent a lot of time. The training sessions were amazing, but maybe I spent I don't know. I won't. They were all really effective, so I won't say too much more. And then I set up my section by centering key aspects of my teaching philosophy with my practice on the ground. So I emphasized, for example, initially bringing real-world problems to the classroom, emphasizing co-creating content and experiences and co-learning alongside my students. Secondly, my commitment to challenging students to think critically. And thirdly, inspiring students to consider how they may intervene and improve circumstances within their communities and more broadly in our tourism sector. And so I crafted a paragraph to provide evidence for each of these areas. So for example, I drew on evidence of valuing undergraduate and graduate students as equal partners in teaching and learning in the teaching and learning process. By describing teaching innovation I co-created with a colleague of mine, which was an integrated curriculum model. And this aligned some of our core content in our degree program, making our content more relevant, engaging, and exciting for students. I also used a tool called Stephen Brookfield's Critical Incident Questionnaire. And this was a tool and evidence to support my commitment to teaching critical thinking in the classroom. And I've analyzed this tool and contributed additional questions to the tool. So I drew attention to my scholarship on teaching and learning to further validate my impact. And then I also listed 3 light seed grants that I was a part of and a light full grant that I secured through CTE. 2 of those I was the principal investigator. I also listed 3 teaching awards that I had won, 2 in the UK, 1 in the US, and 2 nominations here at the University of Waterloo. And lastly, a synthesis of, just like Jeff was mentioning and Rebecca as well, just a tally of the students I had supervised both at their graduate and undergraduate level. Next slide, please. Leading up to tenure, I had 2 very different lines of scholarly inquiry. One was teaching criticality, so teaching critical thinking, adopting critical pedagogical practices. And then the other line was to examine sustainable tourism. So in 2017, just a couple years before I went up for tenure, I crafted a special issue that kind of brought these 2 lines of inquiry together, which helped me kind of weave my narrative, which was missing leading up to tenure. So the special issue was focused on calling our academic community to activate critical thinking, to realize the role of sustainability in tourism systems, reflecting on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So all of a sudden, my 2 worlds collided in terms of my scholarly inquiry. And then I went on to create pedagogical frameworks stemming from this special issue to develop, for example, critical tourism citizens. And so this was really important in formulating that narrative. I also thought it was incumbent to explore my contributions in terms of some of my service roles, which I think Rebecca touched upon as well. So I mentioned that I was an associate editor to a teaching and learning journal in my field, my contributions to teaching in my department as a member of our undergraduate committee, and some invited talks and conference organization and facilitation. Next slide, please. I think a lot of this has been emphasized already in terms of that positive growth trajectory. I had initially drawn on some student feedback on how my courses had improved as I taught them more than once, and drawing on my annual performance review. But my colleagues at the department level, the tenure and promotion committee, just told me to cut it. I think it kind of reiterates what Jeff was saying in terms of cherry picking student feedback. So that got cut, and I just focused on providing the quantitative evidence. If I had left the student feedback in, I'll just share that I recall at least one student reflecting in the student feedback that I got in one of my courses, that there was repetition amongst the material in a course that one of my colleagues taught and a course that I taught. And so the way I could have spun that narrative is to just say that I had applied for a CTE grant, and I was working to kind of to circumvent that concern. I could have said that I was working to improve that, ensure that we don't have repetition in our courses. Yeah, I think we have so many opportunities on campus. I mean, I mentioned I've taken quite a few courses through CTE, and you know, the light grants, I also took advantage of those as well. And then there's formal networks that I've been involved in within my fields, teaching networks. And there's been lots of informal supports as well. A few, I think a couple of people meant the teaching squares. I also suggested a learning pod if you work with other colleagues in your department, or the teaching fellows. There's lots of opportunities for that. You could also say that you're making efforts to attend, all-star presentations from faculty within your department or beyond. One suggestion I didn't list here are the CTE conferences, which if you've attended them, you'll see the all-stars on campus present and the contributions that they're making, which I think is pretty incredible. The last point that I'll mention is just reflecting on some aspirations. I was approached to chair a teaching network in my field, and I declined that in advance of going up for tenure, because I thought that would actually build a case if I thought it was a case more necessary, I think, for going up for full professor. So I didn't take that up until my tenure package was through the door, yeah. So I think that's all I have to share there.
Thank you so much, Karla. Very much appreciated. And now, Trevor, if we could ask you to come forward and speak to us about teaching dossiers.
Sure, thanks. So, hi everyone. Trevor Holmes from the Center for Teaching Excellence. I believe I have taken control of the slides. So when I first advance one, I'll ask if it really did advance or not, because I'm seeing different things on my screen than you might be seeing. I am not only Associate Director of the CTE, but I also teach and have taught since the 1990s or something. So my comments are kind of the ideal about teaching dossiers, and you've just heard what really happens in a few different departments. However, I'm going to try and temper my idealism with also a bit of reality. So yeah, so do you now see a pair of glasses on the screen? Okay, so what is a teaching dossier? It's kind of a way of bringing into focus parts of your curriculum vitae, because the CV is just like this long list of things you've done throughout your whole, scholarly career in chronological order a lot of the time. So it's a lot of lists, but the dossier allows you to kind of explain a little bit of the thinking behind it. It allows you to systematize the academic labor you're doing when you teach, and many others have already talked about this today, but there's invisible to the students' labor that you do and invisible to your colleagues' labor. So you got to make it visible in some way or another. It's like a way of organizing your materials for your successes, your challenges, and your plans in a way that will guide readers in your own discipline, but also readers outside your own discipline towards the evidence that you're providing for your claims. So it's kind of like your dossier is almost like a thesis statement and an argument about your teaching results, right? And what are you aiming for? You're aiming for very strong or strong, right? In your research, you want very strong or strong, and in your teaching, you want very strong or strong. In your service, satisfactory is okay, apparently, according to policy 77. But what does strong teaching look like? We've heard a few people talk about it. this is your chance too to give some context for all the inputs that go into your teaching and the outcomes of your practice and the ways in which you're evaluated from year to year, right? So I guess I'd say that typically, first of all, I'd say why bother doing this if all you're submitting is this like 3 to 5 pages, or in math like a page and a half where you got a paragraph about teaching. And I should add that as your package goes higher and higher up the hierarchy of the university, people look at the most condensed version of it, right? So like you may have got a shoebox of everything like that you give an accountant or something, but in this case, like nobody's going to look through the whole shoebox. They just want to see the cover part, right? As it goes up the hierarchy. So it's helpful, in my mind, it's always been helpful to do a dossier or a portfolio because it helps to do that condensing work that Rebecca talked about. I think if you've thought about it the way that our panelists have thought about it by organizing their stuff, they can then more easily condense it into those page and a half, right, where they connect their philosophy and their practice and their feedback in a story of growth, right, or professional development. So it usually begins with this statement that includes the claims, the narrative examples from your practice, and the evidence that you're about to provide. So you're going to guide the reader towards the evidence. It also provides that context for a variety of readers, right? What would a claim look like? What is a claim about teaching? This is true whether you're, beginning your teaching at Waterloo, or whether you're just at the point of tenure, or whether you're going for continuing lecturership or for full professor. So you might have some claims you want to make about your teaching. For me, a claim might be, I've found that after initial resistance, when I give partial note slides, students learn better than if I give them the whole slides in advance. So I have a claim about that. Then maybe I have a narrative example in a description of practice, right? So I tried this for a few years and I didn't upload any notes. Then, maybe I uploaded tons of notes, but they were getting little out of my lectures either way. So then I looked into some research and found that partial notes are kind of important, and people can then do the labor of their own learning, because I already learned the stuff. So they're doing the work with my partial notes, right? So, and I have some evidence for how that worked, right? So there's a scholarly literature on just about every discipline out there, and about just about every technique there is. So you look up the scholarly literature, you try to make a change, you see how it works. You don't change everything at once, you just change a little bit at a time. Maybe you get a grant like Karla's talking about for studying the change. And then maybe there's a sort of you see a change in some kind of learning that you can explain in a paper or explain in a report. Maybe you even see a change in some of those course perception surveys on a particular element of them. And in that case, maybe that's something to share, something to show. So clearly this is a little bit different from a CV. You can, as we've heard already, enhance a CV a little bit by, I don't think of it as double dipping. I don't think people will think of this as double dipping, but if you have done that curriculum committee work, you could mention that under service in certain ways. You could, in your list of courses I've taught, you could ask the committee to go to Appendix B of your teaching dossier to show how that course was kind of your showcase course that you redesigned several times over a few years, right? So you do need to do some writing. It does require some organization. We do consultations about it, and so contact Monica if you'd like to find someone to work with, or your CTE liaison, about putting together a dossier like this. Now, you may not be asked to submit the whole dossier, but again, it will help you to make visible some things you want to talk about in a shorter way, right? I should mention very briefly, because the question keeps coming up every year and it came up in your pre-submitted questions, what about peer evaluation? And we've heard from the panel that, there's these teaching squares things, there's the CTE liaisons or other CTE staff who can come and do an observation. Those kinds of things, those kinds of activities are less about producing a formal letter for your, tenure file, and more about showing that you're interested in improvement. CTE observation reports are going to be like rounded, okay? They're not going to like praise you to the skies or say that you're a terrible teacher. They're going to identify what went well and what we think you might like try, next. So they're not necessarily things that you would then put in as part of your tenure package. Some people do, but for the most part, they're evidence of your commitment to professional development. Teaching squares are things where, you know, you go and get new ideas from colleagues, talk about why they did what they did. They're not necessarily reviewing your teaching, but they're all kind of good things to do if you have time to do them. And I should probably mention that, yeah, during the pandemic is not an easy time to engage in anything. Right. I think we've all noticed this, and we got to acknowledge that this is going to be a weird year for people after 2 years of all the different things we've had to do to scramble online and in class. Yeah, and you know, some of us had classes suddenly turn to in person February 7th and some at the end of February, and it's been quite a journey. So we welcome your questions at this point in the chat, or you could raise your hand or whatever. And I guess, Monica, you'll run the questions.
I'm happy to have you do so as well, Trevor. I seeded the chat with one question that actually feeds really well into what you just said, which is how do we go about managing the documentation of the impact of online delivery, and either having evaluations pre-COVID, or maybe now that we're coming back post-COVID, how do we make those two different sets of evaluations make sense within the tenure and promotion package?
Yeah, I welcome thoughts from others. I have been teaching during the pandemic myself, but I welcome thoughts from people in the discipline, other disciplines. I would say one thing is that we know these course perception surveys have a great deal of bias built into them, baked into them, right? And so you really need to contextualize them with your stories of practice and your intentions, and what other results there are besides those course perception surveys. So I'll let Rebecca talk about it a bit more.
Well, Trevor, I would never dispute what you're saying, but I would say I agree you want to contextualize it, but I wouldn't take a ton of space to contextualize those student scores, because I think everybody knows what is happening and how students have been struggling to deal with the degree of flexibility that's required of them, and how instructors have been struggling to pivot and with all the uncertainty. And so I wouldn't use up my precious space really elaborating on that too much. I would just address it very head on. I would say a good analogy is like maternity leaves. I had a maternity leave in 2015 before I went up for tenure. And I just said, during this year, I was on maternity leave. So I think you can say, like one or two sentences, like, especially if I think there are studies that show that teaching evaluation scores have gone down for instructor performance, which are more complaints about the situation we're all in. So, you can cite that without using up too much space. Instead, focus on the positive. Take all of the, novel techniques, the increased accessibility, universal design that we've all been able to incorporate more through the tools like, doing online lectures and reducing the number of assessments and things like that. Focus on that and demonstrate to the reviewers that what you've done is taken this as an opportunity to really challenge some of the assumptions you have about the best way to teach, and to adopt new technologies and new approaches that have been proven, or that, and that have been evaluated in the literature as effective. And I think I would take the space to talk about that and show more that you have kind of this open mind about learning approaches and different tools you can use, rather than like making excuses for yourself. I would say really avoid coming across as making excuses for yourself.
Jeff, please, did you have something you wanted to add to that?
No, I was just going to say the same thing as Rebecca. Really use this as an opportunity to talk about how you changed your approach, if you did, and why you thought that was effective. It demonstrates the commitment to trying to improve, and I think that's the important message to take away.
Thank you both ever so much. I do want to also put this question in the chat because it speaks from the position of someone going for promotion to full professor. So wondering how that would be different in terms of what you would prioritize from the teaching side.
I can speak to that, I think. So I think when you're going from associate to full professor, the emphasis is much different. Again, you have to be an effective educator as you were at the tenure time, but really for full professor, typically, although there is a teaching pathway to full professor, the normal pathway to full professor is to demonstrate that you have international and national stature in your research discipline. And so it's a very different standard in terms of what the expectation would be in terms of documenting your teaching. So really, when you get to that point, and of course, read the policy, but what the external reviewers are looking for and what the committees are looking for is normally really excellence and demonstrated international stature in your research and your scholarship. So it's a different threshold. It's not to say that you shouldn't be careful to demonstrate that you are an effective educator, but the emphasis is different.
Thanks ever so much, Jeff. I'm just mindful we're coming to the very close of our session here, so I'm just wondering if in conclusion you'd like to say a few words to wrap up for us.
Sure, I'm happy to do that. And I think that and maybe Monica, I don't mean to put the CTE team on the spot, but certainly if others have questions that haven't been answered, be happy to get those. And if I can be helpful in answering those, I'd be glad to do that. So colleagues, I just want to offer a couple thoughts to close out. I'm sure the tenure process feels daunting, and I'm sure that it feels like it is something you've been thinking a lot about. But I want to just try to communicate that what should happen in the tenure process is this should be really an opportunity for you to reflect on the things that you've been successful through, write those things down, acknowledge the places where there have been challenges and respond to those, and give an evidence that you have been tried to really respond to those challenges in productive ways. And if you do that with your teaching and you are holistic in terms of the way you present your approach to teaching, your thought process on teaching, the way you construct your classes, the learning outcomes that you hope to achieve, the way that you interact with your students, both in the classroom and in your supervisory activities, then you've done your duty in terms of providing the evidence that the committee needs to evaluate your teaching. And of course, the peer evaluation is the one thing that I missed in that list. Let others vet your curriculum design, let others vet your approach to teaching and the learning outcomes and so on. So really, I'm trying to tone down the fear aspect of tenure and increase your approach to saying thoughtfully, this is what I've been successful with, this is the approach I've taken, this is the steps I've taken to be effective, this is how I've engaged others in assessing and improving my effectiveness. Again, and if you do that, then I think you're positioning yourself to be successful in the tenure process. So those are the final remarks I have. I think that maybe just the last comment is to say, don't be hesitant to rely on your peers within your own department and within CTE to provide support and advice. I think that they're there for exactly those purposes. And I think we've heard from our panelists that they've had great success in doing so. So I hope that's helpful in toning down perhaps the fear associated with tenure and to give you some guidance on how to move forward. And I do hope that you are successful, and I very much expect that will be the case.
Thank you all, panelists, Jeff, and attendees. It's been wonderful having you here. We will be sending out a link to the recording. You will have all the resources that have been shared with us, shared back, as well as the presentation itself. So no worries at all. And I'll also append some pointers to some of the events that have been spoken about by our panelists, whether it be the Teaching Squares, the Instructional Skills Workshop, or other possibilities for growth and development. So thank you again, everyone, and all the very best for a great afternoon.